Hello everyone, welcome to my paper today. I'm Dr. Cora Xu from the University of Durham in the UK. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Education and I'm a founder and director of the Network for Research into Chinese Education Mobilities. I'm really glad to share my recent research findings on exploring study toward transition of Chinese international students in UK universities with all of you today. My title of the paper today is Time, Class and Privilege in Career Imagination of these Chinese international students. First of all, I'd like to offer a definition of what I mean by career imagination. And here I'm drawing on Cohen's fascinating work about the career imagination of a group of UK women. And in Cohen's work, she defined career imagination as people's understandings of what careers can look like, as informed by what is collectively perceived as appropriate in particular social locations. Now, such particular social locations and such collective beliefs tend to denote beliefs and discourses such as what kind of career options or routes or paces are appropriate for certain groups of people. For instance, for women, for ethnic minority groups, etc., etc. Very importantly, such career imagination is not static. In other words, it does not just stay the same all the time. Instead, it can be recalibrated and reconfigured as social agents' lives unfold. And therefore, it seems that a temporal perspective that accentuates the evolving nature of an individual's career understanding, as furnished by their shifting living in circumstances over time, should be underlined in this discussion about career imagination. And I argue in my paper that this temporal aspect is actually a little bit underdeveloped in Cohen's work, and this is an area that my paper would seek to make contribution to. Now, specific to international students' career imagination, in my paper I argue that a temporal perspective is lacking, and this is based on my critiques of existing research and existing policies pertaining to international students' employment or employability. Very often we see that international students are statisticized, as lifeless figures that constitute graduate employment indicators. And here you can see examples of higher education authorities or institutions that would compile reports about their graduates, especially international graduates' employment outcomes. And very often you see that they are just anything but, only but a figure, right? Very often international students are also individualized. They are frequently assumed to be individual free agents who are able to respond to a suite of policies, including migration policies, in line with their individual career or lifestyle preferences. As such, it seems that they are often disembedded from the very complex networks and webs of relationships that they are already established within. And therefore, we tend to ignore, for instance, their caring responsibilities, their intimate relationships, sort of responsibilities. The third critique is that international students, when it comes to a discussion about their career or employment, they are often homogenized, as if they are typically fitting a specific persona, which I think Joanna Waters described very vividly. They are frequently portrayed to be financially secure, have the support, both emotional and material support from parents and families and friends, and would have been raised in an environment that places great value on formal education and credentials, and have highly educated parents and have experienced overseas travel as a child. But we all know that, and especially more and more new research, including my own research, has shown that there is actually quite a heterogeneous scene in terms of the international students population in the West and otherwise. Now, here, therefore, we see that it seems that when it comes to discussing international students' employment or careers, there have been prevalent focuses on the present, on the now of the international students' employability outcomes or employability trajectory, but there's much oblivion of the unpredictable future and impact of the passage of time on these students' post-study career enactment. And here I'm referring to Collins and Shubin's work in 2017, where they made a very poignant argument in this regard. And therefore, my critique could be summarized as that, as of now, there has been very little empirical and policy attention that has been paid to the heterogeneous composition of international students, especially the differentiated nature and need of understanding international students' backgrounds and their career development or enactment. And there has been much less attention that has been dedicated to understanding how time, which I briefly underlined before about the temporal perspective, the importance of the temporal perspective in career imagination, right? There has been very little understanding about how time features in and shapes the career imagination of international students. And in view of these gaps in the research and literature as well as policies, I have two aims in this paper. The first is to provide a theoretical vocabulary for understanding how time features in and shapes the Chinese international students' career imagination that I researched. And the second aim was to pinpoint how class, privilege, and time intersect to underpin their temporal career strategies. And I'll argue that by achieving these two aims, my paper or my findings could serve as an anchoring point for informing better differentiated career supports for international students at policy and practice levels. In other words, these could be applied, through universities, career support services, and through policy making. Now, in order to do that, I would like to first of all draw on Pierre Bourdieu's work as well as various other scholars' work to conceptualize time in two different ways. The first way is to, following Chen 2014, is to conceptualize time as a form of coveted cultural capital. Cultural capital is from Pierre Bourdieu. And the possession of time and free deployment of time can therefore be highly stratified along class lines and shapes the adoption of career strategies such as waiting, which I'm going to discuss in greater detail later. The second way to conceptualize time would be time would be considering time as integral to the field, to the social environment, to our social environments, basically, and as sedimented within the Chinese international students' habitus, which is, their dispositions. Again, this is a Bourdieusian term, thus inclining them towards certain career preferences or attitudes or approaches over others. Okay. In other words, their relationship with time can inform their career approaches and preferences. And through this process, these students and their actions, their career enactments, thus reinforce and reproduce forms of class privilege. So, apart from drawing on these scholars' work to conceptualize time, I have also turned to the sociology of time literature to look for terms to help to explain my empirical data. And these two terms I found particularly pertinent, and they include deferred gratification and temporal destructuring. Deferred gratification has been discussed by various scholars within the canon of sociology of time, and the most poignant ones, I would argue, from Barbara Adam. And for instance, in her 1990 work, she suggested that some deferred gratification forms an integral part of growing up and becoming socialized. And this very much constitutes what Bourdieu's notion of habitus encapsulates. which is a set of dispositions sedimented by one's familial upbringing and socialization. In other words, our relationship with time, especially this our tendency or approach towards time or towards engaging with time, as manifested in the form of deferred gratification, has been deeply embedded within certain individuals' habitus. Yeah. And then the second term that I got from the sociology of time literature was about temporal destructuring, and this was from 𝗦𝗲𝗙𝗿𝗲𝗿 and Rampers's 1993 work, in which they argue that some youths, they may foreground the search for alternative life paths, ones no longer subjected to strict and uniform rhythms and timetables, but built from autonomous and reversible choices as new opportunities for personal becoming. While the context in which they discussed this was more about European youth, in my study, I find that many of my Chinese international student participants had also sort of contested and indeed resisted and rebelled against a set of strict and uniform rhythms and timetables and paces and paths that were regulated by the temporal structures that were dominant in their place of origin, and instead they sought alternative paths. And therefore, I found that this concept of temporal destructuring particularly relevant in understanding my empirical data, which I'm going to show you in a moment. Now, here is a little bit of details about the study that I conducted. This was part of a larger mixed method study, which included a survey that was administered to more than 400 Chinese international students from various British higher education institutions. But in this paper, I draw particularly on the qualitative aspect of the study. It included 21 Chinese international students or graduates with British degrees, and they were aged between 18 and 33. So you could argue that they were, youth, according to some of my colleagues. And the study was conducted between May 2018 and April 2019, with follow-up interviews in 2020. These participants were pursuing a range of degrees at different levels, including bachelor's, master's, and PhD levels. And 15 of them were female participants and 6 were male participants. They were from a range of institutions. Some are from the newer institutions, some are from the older and more well-established and probably arguably more prestigious institutions in the UK. So just now I briefly mentioned that I borrow from the sociology of time literature these two terms, deferred gratification and temporal destructuring. And here are my definitions of deferred gratification and temporal destructuring as appropriate to my empirical data. But specifically, I am referring to, when I talk about these Chinese international students' deferred gratification as a temporal career strategy, I'm referring to the fact that when they planned or enacted their career trajectories, some of them chose to withstand unfavorable conditions for a period, with a view to reaping rewards of autonomous career time later in the future. And later I am going to show you some actual cases, empirical cases. Now the second one, when I refer to the temporal destructuring career strategy, I mainly refer to them, their directly confrontation with the capitalist market logic that attempted to extend their work time, especially through the lens of overtime work culture, or the temporal structures that regulated their career path and pace. And it was very salient that some of my participants were very sort of constrained by a certain set of 3 or 4 career options, and they felt very much constrained, like I said. And instead of conforming to these, they searched for alternative career paths and paths that were not subjected to such uniform rhythms and timetables prescribed by their families and sometimes by the broader society in China. Instead, they strove to build their career of their autonomy of career choices. Right. So when we discuss career gratification, I would like to evoke three cases. First of all, Men's and Lee's cases are quite similar in the sense that they both went through a waiting period in order to engage in work that they truly passionate for. So Men's case was that she came to a very prestigious London university to pursue her master's from China, and she chanced upon this opportunity where she joined a entrepreneurship competition held by her university, and she won a prize. And the prize was £3,000, but also the university sponsorship of a graduate entrepreneur visa, which could grant her a 5 years stay in the UK to work on her business, which was on destination wedding planning. She confessed that she did not even think about the prospect of staying in the UK, but because of this sudden opportunity, she sort of seized upon this opportunity, and she convinced her family to invest in this opportunity. So she said that she had to have £10,000 in her bank account, which she obviously did not have, so her family had to pay for that. But also, when she had the startup business, she had to stay in London, and her family actually bought a house in London, so she did not have to worry about paying rent. She could focus single-mindedly on her destination wedding planning business. So you can see here that her family's investments also play a pivotal role in enabling her to engage with this waiting period. So when I asked her about, so how do you think about this destination wedding planning business, she suggested that what I'm doing now is not that profitable, but also it's very repetitive. In fact, she did not have any passion for this business, but she had to dwell in this business for 5 years before she could apply for the indefinite leave to remain. And she revealed that her real passion, her real interest was actually in the real estate business. So at the time when I interviewed her, she was still within this 5-year period, and her vision was to switch to a career that she was really passionate for. Now, in Lee's case, Lee was further along the path of this deferred gratification. By the time I interviewed Lee, he had already acquired his indefinite leave to remain, and he was working in the luxury retail industry, which was his real passion that he developed when he was an undergraduate student in the UK. Now, Lee's trajectory was quite similar in the sense that after he did his sixth form and his undergraduate studies, he was early enough. It was I think 2012. He was able to get 2 years post-study work visa, and by 2014, he had already been in the UK for 9 years. So he needed an extra year to apply for the indefinite leave to remain. So what he did was he convinced, similar to Man, convinced his family to invest in his business, in his milk tea business in London, and then through that he got the graduate entrepreneur visa for 2 years, which allowed her to meet the 10-year threshold of having stayed in the UK, and also to prepare for the application for the indefinite leave to remain. So in both cases, this protracted period of waiting could be considered as a time tax, according to Gasparini's work, 1995 work. Yeah. Now, different from Men and Lee's families who were able to invest, substantial amount of money in their waiting strategy, Xiao's case was a little bit different, but generally similar. So Xiao's case was that her family does not have so much money, so she was actually willing to engage in work that was not necessarily meaningful to her in order to rapidly reach financial freedom. So she, at the time when I interviewed her, she was doing her PhD, but she had already been looking for jobs that would give her quite a lot of financial returns, and also in a quite a rapid way. And so she could then fulfill her goal, her career goal of doing something meaningful, as encapsulated in this quote. She said, "The end point of my ideal career is to have financial freedom. I will not need to work in order to make money, and I can do things that I find truly meaningful, truly valuable to me." And when I questioned her, well, what do you mean by being meaningful? What kind of work is meaningful? She said, I would, for instance, would volunteer for an entire year in Africa, working in some non-governmental organizations there and help more people. And in fact, in my paper, I have engaged with the body of literature that suggested that, according to the capitalist market logic, this kind of work is often deemed as unproductive, as not really allowing to reap any financial rewards. But to Xiao, this actually is meaningful. However, in order to reach this stage, she had to endure work that may not be that meaningful to her, but could give her greater and quicker accumulation of financial capital. So these three cases, I will argue, encapsulate what I mean by deferred gratification as a temporal career strategy among these Chinese international students that I interviewed. Now, the second type of strategy is what I call temporal destructuring. And here I'm citing the cases of Qiye and Chang. Qiye had a very poignant sort of discussion with our team. He initially rejected 3 job offers in China because of his concern about the 996 model. And now the 996 model was a very hit, or has been a very hit term in the work scene of China. Basically, it means that you work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. for 6 days a week, which is encapsulated by the 996, these 3 digits, 996. And it really denotes a very, very severe lack of personal time. And here in this quote, you can see that Xie was saying that, some of his previous classmates who had got degrees in the UK, they returned to China, and he thinks that they are in a pitiable position because, although they have entered some very good companies like Huawei, Tencent, and Baidu, they have a very stressful life. They have to undergo compulsory overtime work, and some have lost all their hair. And all of these, to Qie, he found it very scary. He said, right, your salary will surely be very high, but you may not be able to live long enough to spend the money that you make. In Chinese, it's 有命赚钱没命花钱, and that feels horrific to Qie. So he refused job offers from China, and he instead took up a job in UK's research institute after his PhD, and then he worked there for 3 years. And by the time we interviewed him in 2018, he was switching to another job in UK, but he was also considering returning to work in China. But this time it was a very different condition for him. This time he had already gained quite a few patent rights, and this time he felt that he could have his own say on his time autonomy. As I reviewed in this quote, he said, there are many high-end talent schemes like 1,000 talent scheme in China, and if I join this scheme, my development in China would be fast. And basically, they have all kinds of money to give me convenience, and I can set my own rules at work. Effectively, he was talking about setting up his own lab where he can hire his own staff, and he can set his own work rules in his lab. So as you can see, this is a very fluid and evolving sort of process in Qie's career decision making. In both cases, he was destructuring. He was rebelling against the sort of temporal structure that was to be imposed on him were he to return to China, the sort of overtime work culture. The first way for him to resist such a temporal structure was to not return to China and work, but instead working in an environment where he can have better work-life balance. Now, the second time, he was actually returning to China, but this time he could set his own rules. In his own lab, he could lay out his own work rules and still achieve his own time autonomy. Now, of course, I'm not trying to depict the UK as the paradise of work-life balance. In fact, the UK is not necessarily the best place for my participants. In fact, as shown through the case of Chang, she got her dream job in London after her master's study in the UK, and however, when she now looks back on her experience of working in London, it was not a very satisfactory or satisfying experience for her. She said, I was a fresh graduate with only 30K of income per year, and after paying rent, tax, food, and some entertainment, she could not have any savings. And the job was all about auditing, and she did not find it interesting. She had to work until late, and with no money and no personal life, what was the meaning of all that, right? So she was very much challenging or finding sort of confined by this kind of job, by her dream job initially, her dream job in London. So because of this, she then took a short foray back to China, and then she eventually relocated to Switzerland, where she now has a job, where she now wake up every morning and feels she cannot wait to go back to work, and she thinks that it's an ideal job. Again, in this job she feels passionate about, but you can see that the problems that she depicted when she was working in London have been solved in this job in Switzerland. So here I want to underline how pivotal it is for these Chinese international students and graduates to be exposed to alternative possibilities of work environments, of cultures, rhythms, and pace, so that they can feel for themselves, they can reflect, and then make their decisions. So in this paper, I argue that I make both theoretical contributions as well as more empirical and practical contributions. In the theoretical front, I think my contribution would lie in the bringing in time to factor in our discussion of career imagination for international students. So in this paper, I primarily conceptualize time as a form of cultural capital, which means that access to time is necessarily differentiated. Okay, so for instance, some of my participants are privileged enough to have this opportunity or this option of waiting for deferred gratification, because these are enabled through their abundant access to familial economic capital and familial emotional support, for instance. However, deferred gratification or temporal destructuring may not be feasible for the less privileged international students, and there are indeed such international students who are not as privileged. But more importantly, I conceptualize time not just as a form of cultural capital, but more than a form of resource. It is about our relationship with time, which informs who we are, how we relate to others, and what we consider as worth doing in our career imagination. For instance, Xiao's aspiration of working in the NGO sector, for instance, this kind of work has been traditionally sidelined or marginalized as unproductive work that does not bring you a lot of economic returns. But however, our relationship with time can inform our understanding of what we strive for, what we crave for in our career. And therefore, you see that in my paper, I have shown how people rejected the more conventional or hegemonic temporal structures, like Qi's case, who refused 3 job offers in China. And instead, they embraced alternative ones, such as the case of Qi and Chang. And also, in the case of Meng and Li, who took up the deferred gratification strategy, their readiness to embrace such waiting, such time tax, was also related to their relationship with time and related to their class privilege, their ready access to a lot of economic capital. And therefore, I argue that in this paper, I provide a theoretical vocabulary for thinking about career imagination in a class and temporally sensitive manner. In terms of my empirical and practical contributions, I would argue that I have adopted a temporally sensitive research approach because in my sample I include participants who are not only at their participants who are at their pre-employment stage where they anticipate or they talk about their aspirations, but I also include participants who have been at work, who have been on their various jobs, and I invited their reflections and retrospections within this sample. And this is what distinguishes my study from much of existing studies which predominantly look at the pre-employment stage of international students' career strategies, etc. Yeah, so I argue that including both perspectives have enabled us to show there's some very substantial recalibration and reconfiguration of career plans among this group of international students that I researched, but also showcased or demonstrated the evolving and fluid nature of career imagination of these Chinese international students. The examples that I have cited in my paper also offer lively and vivid examples that international students are not really lifeless figures, but they constantly evolve in terms of their career imaginations. And therefore, this kind of understanding will necessitate career support services that can help them to explore their longer term or long-term aspirations and pointing out alternative temporal structures and possibilities to these students. Yeah, so in this sense, we have some practical sort of contributions for university career services. So this was the paper that this lecture has been based on, and if you are interested and if you cannot get access to a copy, please do feel free to email me. And these are some of my contacts. Thank you very much.